You are listening to Last Stand at Wake, The Forgotten Survivors, an audio-only program for war stories with Mark Felton. The Battle of Wake Island is one of the great last stands in military history, where a few hundred defenders, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, held out far longer than anyone expected and exhibited a ferocity the enemy did not anticipate. The fates of many of those men, both military and civilian, who had resisted the enemy is a sorry tale of abuse and murder at the hands of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In January 1941, the U.S. Navy had begun construction of a permanent base on the tiny Pacific atoll lying between Hawaii and Guam, measuring only 2.5 square miles, which included a modern airfield. Elements of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, amounting to 449 officers and men, formed a permanent garrison, and it was supported by Marine Corps Fighter Squadron VMF 211, operating 12 outdated Grumman F-4F Wildcats. There were also 68 U.S. Navy personnel and 1,150 civilian contractors on the island when the Japanese attack came. Several First World War vintage 5-inch guns from a defunct American cruiser had been emplaced at strategic points around the atoll, and a variety of anti-aircraft weapons were dug in. All the American forces on Wake came under U.S. Navy officer Commander Winfield S. Cunningham. The Japanese first attempted to reduce Wake on the 8th of December 1941, the same day their carrier planes devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Wake being on the opposite side of the international dateline. A bomber offensive was launched that managed to destroy 8 of the Wildcats on the ground. On the morning of the 11th of December, a Japanese task force, codenamed the South Seas Force, approached the atoll, consisting of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a pair of large patrol boats, escorting a pair of troop transports loaded with 450 special naval landing troops. Incredibly, the American defenders were able to send this force packing, sinking the destroyer Hayate with 5-inch shells from their dug-in and concealed naval guns, and damaging most of the other ships in a hailstorm of shot and shell. The remaining aircraft of VMF 211 took to the skies and managed to bomb and sink the destroyer Kisaragi, forcing the Japanese to place Wake under an aerial siege from land-based medium bombers until a new task force could be constituted. Deeply humiliated, the Japanese invasion force retreated with its tail quite literally between its legs. In the meantime, Admiral Wilson Brown's Task Force 14 had left Pearl Harbor and was steaming towards Wake to relieve the defenders. Brown's force included the aircraft carriers USS Saratoga and Lexington. The problem was that although the warships were quite swift, they had been forced to match their cruising speeds to a slow and elderly fleet oiler, so that collectively Brown's task force made slow progress towards Wake. Sadly, when the American task force was within a day of reaching Wake, Vice Admiral William Pye, acting Commander-in-Chief of what was left of the Pacific Fleet, had second thoughts about risking his carriers in a showdown with a more powerful Japanese fleet known to be converging on Wake for a second invasion attempt, and he ordered Brown to turn around and return his vessels to Pearl Harbor. The defenders of Wake were abandoned by the American government to their fate, but their refusal to surrender when faced with overwhelming Japanese naval power and a stand and fight to the end proved a huge morale boost to the American public, depressed after the surprise attack on Hawaii. On the 23rd of December 1941, Vice Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka's large invasion fleet arrived off Wake. After beginning their landings at 2:35 a.m., by the afternoon 1,500 Japanese naval landing troops had come ashore and slowly began to overcome fanatical American resistance, suffering horrendous casualties in the process. The guns fell silent on Wake on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, 24th of December, the day before the British colony of Hong Kong also surrendered after another heroic last stand. Emerging from their defensive positions, 1,603 American men, both military and civilian, placed themselves in the hands of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Most probably, they assumed that the worst was now over for them, and their timely capitulation had saved many of their lives when it became clear to their commanders that further resistance was completely futile. American honor had been served in making such a stout defense of the island, and to continue to the last man last round was not normally a part of the Western military ethos. American expectations of decent treatment after having fought so gallantly were swiftly dispelled. The Japanese had lost anywhere between 700 and 900 naval personnel in their 2 attempts to take the island, and at least another 1,000 had been wounded. Besides the human cost, Japanese naval pride had been damaged by the loss of 2 destroyers and 20 aircraft. The Americans had come off much better, losing a total of 122 killed, including 49 of the garrison's Marines. The Japanese felt that they had been unexpectedly humiliated by this thorn in their side, their otherwise triumphant advance across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and were in a vengeful mood. Collecting up their prisoners, the Japanese found that the majority were actually American civilians. 1,150 employees, the Morrison-Knudsen Company, sent to Wake to construct an airfield and a seaplane and submarine base for the U.S. Navy before the invasion. The remainder were military prisoners from the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy. The fact that so many of the Americans who had fought the Japanese were civilians and not professional military forces must have further angered the Japanese commanders. The Japanese Special Naval Landing Force unit that took the Americans prisoner viewed their new charges with barely concealed disgust. Firstly, this motley collection of Americans had repulsed the first invasion attempt and somehow had managed to put up a ferocious resistance when the Japanese had actually managed to land in force. But they had nonetheless surrendered instead of selling their lives dearly for the island, and no Japanese serviceman could understand that. It went against everything the sailors had been taught since their basic training, and they had no respect for men who waved white flags and negotiated their own survival. Ignorant of the cultural differences between the 2 fighting nations, their officers led the Japanese sailors to believe that the prisoners would be finished off as soon as possible. To this end, the Americans were disarmed and marched under a heavy guard to the shell-scarred airfield runway and ordered to sit quietly in ranks. Machine guns were quickly set up to cover the large group of prisoners, and for many it began to look as though the Japanese intended to mow them down where they sat without further ado. Although many of the more junior Japanese naval officers were keen to kill the prisoners as soon as possible, Rear Admiral Kajioka, the commander of the Japanese invasion fleet, intervened and forbade any such action. The prisoners were to be kept alive for the time being, and a proper decision would be made higher up the chain of command regarding their ultimate fate. The good news was transmitted to the massed ranks of huddled prisoners, filthy, thirsty, and exhausted after the fight for their lives, by a naval interpreter. "The Emperor has gracefully presented you with your lives," the interpreter announced, to which some wise-cracking American shouted, "Well, thank the son of a bitch." Such self-confidence was soon to be knocked out of the prisoners as their ordeal began to unfold. The prisoners spent an uncomfortable 3 days lying around on the ruined surface of the runway, made worse by the fact that many of them were sick with dysentery, while others were wounded and in need of medical attention. It rained a lot, and a fierce wind chilled them further. The Japanese only distributed some bread and water, and at meal times there was an undignified struggle for food, with fistfights breaking out among the bad-tempered men. Their senior officers and the contractors' overseers had been taken inside away from their men, and maintaining discipline was a next to impossible task. On Christmas Day, the prisoners, under escort, were sent off to their former dugouts to collect clothing, tobacco, and food, and many were put to work burying the dozens of corpses of their comrades lying all over the island. After completing these tasks, over the 3 days the men were herded into an abandoned barracks complex to the north of the island. Thereafter, the Japanese appeared to relax a little and to treat the men a little better. For 3 weeks the prisoners loitered around their barracks, until one morning a large Japanese merchant ship hove to in the lagoon. She was the Nitta Maru, and her mission was to remove the majority of the men to prison camps in China. The Nitta Maru departed from Wake on the 12th of January 1942, and into her filthy holds were crammed 1,222 American prisoners, with 381 contractors and wounded U.S. Marines remaining behind on Wake. This hell ship, on which food and water was virtually non-existent for the frozen prisoners huddled together in their own filth in the bowels of the vessel, arrived in Yokohama in Japan on the 20th of January, and then the ship set sail again for China. The Japanese evidently still felt that they had not been given the chance to take out their frustrations on the American prisoners who had fought them so well, and now, away from the gaze of Admiral Kajioka, junior officers plotted a vengeful attack on the defenseless men held down below like animals. Once out at sea, the Japanese guards suddenly bundled 5 of the prisoners topside. The men, all from the naval air station on Wake, were to be tortured to death, in order, said the Japanese, to honor their bravery in the defense of the island. 3 seamen second class, Theodore Franklin, John Lambert, and Roy Gonzalez from Patrol Wing 2, and 2 U.S. Marine Corps NCOs from Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 211, Master Technical Sergeant Earl Hannum and Technical Sergeant Vincent Bailey, were the unfortunate ones selected to satisfy the Japanese version of naval honor. Perhaps the Japanese wanted to make an example of these seamen and Marines who had been intimately involved with the valiant American air defense of the island, bearing in mind the damage inflicted on the first Japanese invasion fleet, particularly by the aircraft of VMF 211. The men were tied up, severely beaten, and then beheaded with swords by Japanese naval officers. The headless bodies of the 5 American servicemen were then used by Japanese sailors for bayonet practice, until mutilated beyond recognition they were dumped over the ship's side like bags of refuse. Tune in next time to discover the fates of those left behind on Wake. You have been listening to Last Stand at Wake, The Forgotten Survivors, an audio-only program for War Stories with Mark Felton. For a wide variety of military history videos, visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.